Hey, what is up? What is going on? Arvind Ramkrishna here, and welcome to Driven to Draw. And today we are going to be talking about how I tackle sketching difficult objects. So let's get started. So I'm just choosing an object here where I want, well, maybe not an object, but a very cool Tron light cycle. And when I first was thinking about drawing this, I thought, boy, this is going to be really tough, especially if I get in this habit where I just don't draw for a long period of time. You know, we get busy and you got a lifestyle of going to work and just taking care of your family and all this other stuff, and you're trying to carve a little bit of time out to go back and do what you love. And for me, it's sketching. I mean, it's engaging into the process of being creative and just getting out there and just doing something that you love. And sometimes when you get really rusty, when you haven't done something in such a long time, what happens is that you sometimes forget your own techniques. I really struggle sometimes, and I don't know if you have one of those days where you try to get back into the habit and you feel just awful and you're so rusty, and then, you know, when things don't come out good, you end up hating your own drawings, and then it just demotivates you from going back and practicing. And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about, is how to sort of get out of that funk and start to draw difficult objects. And so, you know, some of you, maybe if you might not think the light cycle is very difficult if you've ever drawn one of these things, but I picked this thing up and I looked at some of the photo references, and I really loved Tron. I was an 80s kid, and when a new Tron movie came out, I was like, wow, I have got to give this a shot and try to draw this stuff. And so my approach is, when I start to look at a difficult object, I really try to, or what I perceive to be difficult is, I try to break everything down to basic and fundamental shapes. And I never try to hide all my construction lines. I think before, when I was younger, I used to not want to show how I was going about the process about thinking about an object and then trying to replicate it on a piece of paper. I never did it because I didn't want to see my other construction lines, because I felt it ruined the drawing. But tip number one, I would say, go for it. I mean, always try to show your construction lines, because once you finish the construction lines, you can go back with another sheet of paper and just overlay and just not draw the skeletal structure of that object. So, my approach here is, there's actually a lot more technical details here when you're starting to draw ellipse, where you can set up your minor axes of how they're converging to your vanishing points. That's usually the first start that we go when we draw a picture like this. Then you got the offset ellipses to kind of indicate that we have a tire here. But overall, when you're looking at this object, you've got kind of like a cylindrical shape. And that's how you have to approach these things, is to break these things down into their basic fundamental form. Alright, so now we got your construction lines. You've sort of highlighted that your basic shapes are basic, or are just cylinders, right? Well, then what do you do next? Well, you need to now start to build from that, and just start to add a little bit of details and just darken up some of the lines where you had your construction lines. And then maybe start adding a little bit of your sections to sort of define some of these shapes. So here on the front wheel that I'm looking at, I'm just, I'm drawing all these offset of shapes. And then sometimes, when I'm looking at this photo reference, I don't, I'm trying to understand, well, what are these shapes doing? And then how do I sort of define those shapes? Well, that's where I just come across and I just start to add these section lines here. And remember, any other kind of details that I'm adding, especially if there's going to be some sort of a cylinder that is coming out, or just areas where you have some sort of a brake or some caliper or something like that. I don't know. I don't even know what some of these things are here on this vehicle, but on this light cycle. But you have to still maintain the certain properties of perspective, right? So if you're using the minor axes that we had shown before, then you start to use that same minor axis to add all these objects, just like I've added it here on this front wheel. So after I've added all these basic shapes, well, I just keep continuing on to the rest of the object and just continue to define areas that I haven't defined, right? So that'll just involve continuing on with adding these sections and these little details. And what they do is just to help your own understanding of what's going on and what's happening on these shapes. That's why, when you're looking at these photo references, it's important to kind of dissect and try to really understand what is happening with these shapes. Because the further you start asking, the more you start asking yourself these questions, the more it starts to solidify into your long-term memory. Because, as you start doing this more and more often, you're going to start building that visual vocabulary, and then you'll be able to recall some of these shapes and then figure out how to kind of create things on your own. And then, the last tip here is to just add a little bit of detailing here. Is that, once you've finished, your tip number one was to just break things down into basic shapes and fundamental forms. And the second step was to define some of those forms even further by adding those sections. And then lastly, what you're going to do is just do a little bit of detail work and a little bit of shading just to sort of bring the entire drawing to life. And sometimes you don't even need to do that much. I mean, here I'm just using a lot of just minimal lines and stuff just to define and finish off the drawing. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this particular episode. Like what you saw here, just don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And just give me some suggestions for what you'd like to see next time. And we'll see you next week in Driven to Draw. Have a good one.